So, given that, I think it's kind of good for us to dive into the money a little bit, understanding how is this changing? How are new innovations coming to the market differently in 2024, and how has that shifted from 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And one of the articles you brought up, before this call that I found really interesting was that there's this new era for VCs, venture capital and private funding, that we have to change the way that we look at how funding is happening for companies, because it changes the way that CIOs are trying to invest and trying to partner and trying to identify new solutions that they can integrate into their ecosystems. It's a big challenge right now. We live in a world where the average large multi-billion-dollar enterprise has over 1,000 SaaS apps and honestly is trying to cut down. But at the same time, there are more and more capabilities that CIOs continue having to bring into their environments. Business is not getting less complicated or less distributed by any means.
Yeah, so this article is actually from a Substack called Digital Native by a gentleman by the name of Rex Woodbury, who is a VC. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting from my standpoint because, I'm an IT guy, so I haven't actually had that much exposure throughout my career to the whole world of VCs and private equity and funding, right? I've just been the consumer, and even as an analyst, that's been the perspective that I've brought. It's like, that might be a signal, but that hasn't been my focus. And so this article it's a little bit of inside baseball. It's a little bit talking about sort of the evolution of the industry, but what it's really, the big point it's trying to make is that historically, the VC or any investors really, they're two things they're bringing, right? It's about labor and it's about capital. And that investment profile is, historically was sort of both. And what his proposition, I guess, or his supposition is that it's diverging, that there's now going to be this sort of class of VC that is really focused on the labor, that's focused on building out the team and identifying, how to nurture that team. And it's about the smaller bets. What I would argue is kind of the traditional VC road. But you're now seeing this other sort of angle, but that it's really focused on capital, that it's about big bets, big funds, large investments. And I think it speaks to what we've been talking about. And, he sort of leaves it on the fence, but I think he's sort of implying that there's a case to be made that the artisan, as he calls it, investing makes a ton of sense, and that's going to create the great innovation. And I think there's probably a lot of truth and value in that. But as we've been pointing out, I think it's also going to be really dependent on the use case, on what the focus is, because, as we've been talking about, is the whole NVIDIA thing is pointing out, so much of this is about these big swings now, and that the cost of doing it. The one thing that we sort of didn't talk about is that, the NVIDIA proposition, that this new data architecture, not only is it a whole new thing, it's insanely expensive.
Yes.
And so, if you're going to these use cases that are leveraging this sort of technology, there's a massive amount of money involved in doing that. And therefore you're getting these huge funds and huge investments. And that's why we're now seeing things we never saw startups getting $1 billion in funding before.
Right.
And now we're seeing it happen with a almost a routine kind of thing. And so I think it just, for me, putting the CIO lens on, it just means that I think you can't just be looking at a potential software company, particularly if they're a startup, and solely look at their feature set and are they helping you solve a problem. That should always be your starting point. But I think now you need to look at where are they getting their investments from? What do they say? Do they have enough money to compete in this space? Is this just going to be a good idea, but are they going to be able to be big enough to play? And I think it's something that historically we just didn't think about, at least in those same terms. And so that was my big takeaway when I was reading this article. It was really, I highly recommend it. It was really fascinating.
Yeah. So I started my career working at venture capital backed startups. And let me tell you, the fundraising part is not fun. You create a deck and you sell yourself to 100 different firms. It is a very hardcore sales process that is very repetitive. And unless you really enjoy that pitching. It's not a very enjoyable process. I think even if you do, it's a very repetitive thing since you're selling a very specific thing over and over and over again. But be that as it may, I feel like the process was more straightforward, call it 20 years ago, where you were trying to raise $10 million with the promise of getting to, call it, a $50 million a year business. The idea is you're adding some rocket fuel to an idea that was ready to go and was going to make some money over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. And if you had the opportunity to get to the next level, okay, that's where you get your $50 million round. So you can get to being a $1 billion business. Pretty straightforward. There was some relationship between the amount of funding and then the amount of revenue you're trying to make and the type of valuation you're getting to. And then somewhere over the last 5 years or 5, 6 years, this disconnect started happening because valuation started getting so high and being so divorced from reality that you just kind of threw $50 million at something and hoped that you would get to $1 billion valuation because you didn't actually have to sell anything to get there. It's like it was kind of like the dot-com era all over again, where you could just kind of throw money at an interesting idea or some sort of cyber currency or some sort of metaverse idea or what have you, and you kind of got there. And I think we kind of saw that just because you had $100 million in funding as a startup didn't mean that you were necessarily a viable startup or a service that a CIO could invest in. It was kind of got we kind of got to that point, and now we're trying to figure out how to get back to the point where having a couple of years of runway, actually what defines a couple of years of runway and what makes you at least worth investing in or worth gambling in. And it's